solution architect in Mars, and some of the things that I currently do in Mars as part of my role is migrating applications from cloud to cloud. And when we migrate, most of the time, to ensure most of the cloud native design is met, right? So that's what I largely do. And one of the interesting things that I'm currently working is building robust distributed workflows using a open source framework called Temporal. I'm not sure if people have heard of Temporal, but that's a very good open source framework to build distributed workflows. Maybe in the networking time we can talk about that as well, right? So that's what we do. And of course, Musk is in shipping and logistics, and we are doing large scale migrations from cloud to cloud, and that's an interesting space to work on. And I blog at Ashnode, and that's my Twitter handle, and I think LinkedIn handle is also available. It's on that share, right? So you can probably reach out to me to that. So today we are going to cover two topics. The first one is on Azure functions and mainly around the integrations with Azure SQL. And the second topic is around Power Developer. It's basically I'm going to talk about Power Pages. So Power Pages is a new kit in the Power Platform of Microsoft. So we're going to talk about Power Pages, and I can also show you a demo of how we can quickly build a low-code, no-code based web application. So, and these two topics are not so related to each other. Of course, I will also show a way to to link data from Power Pages. How can it go to Azure SQL and whatnot in case if we have time to take. So that's the point. So we'll start with Azure functions, which is our first topic of the day today. And I think I'm not going to get into the details of what Azure functions and all that, because most of the people I'm sure aware of what Azure functions are and pretty much use some flavor of Azure functions, if not right. And Azure SQL, both of these services are existing for quite some time, right? So there is Azure functions for quite some time, and Azure SQL is also existing. And some of the use cases I want to tell, right, how people are relating Azure SQL with Azure functions, and some of the business use cases that is currently being used by people in the industry, right? So we have a lot of data that is getting into Azure SQL, right? And one of the common problem that we usually have is to build data ingestion pipelines, right? For example, if you have some sort of IoT kind of data which is coming from different streams, and if you want to do some sort of massaging over the data and you want to ingest into SQL, so that's where a common platform where people link Azure functions and Azure SQL together. And another common platform, another common paradigm that we have seen is the data from the Azure SQL. People want to export into Azure functions by reading the data and then push it into another third-party interface called Stream Analytics. Again, Azure Stream Analytics is another service from Azure where you can push the data and you can do live real-time reporting on top of it. Right? So that's another use case that people build. And I think Azure functions people know, right? I mean, it is so powerful. It has got HTTP trigger, blob trigger, timer trigger, and whatnot, right? So people exploit these triggers. And one of the common things is if you want to run some sort of batch jobs in Azure SQL, right? You can of course have an Azure function with batch triggers, and the notification is another thing which you want to notify some sort of events is happening in Azure SQL, and you want to notify your end customers or your end if you're another product, right? So those are the things that people do in impressive apps using integrations, right? And the data from Azure SQL can also be iterated into a cognitive service, Azure Cognitive Services, and you can build impressive apps with enriching the data. And another common use case is people pretty much trying to do is migrating the applications, right? So you have an Azure SQL which is you have a SQL server which is on-prem, and you want to migrate into Azure SQL, right? Of course, the migrations is by itself a different topic, but once the migrations is done, the integrations with Azure SQL and Azure Functions is giving to open up a lot more use cases where you can build a lot more impressive apps, right? So these are some of the common use cases where people want to link Azure Functions with Azure SQL. And of course, why do we want to do it, right? Of course, people have been using SQL functions for so long, right? It's not something new. But the integrations between Azure Function and SQL is going to simplify the development, right? And we will show you in the demo, right, how it is going to simplify writing an Azure Functions integrated with Azure SQL, and how you can quickly build an API out of it. So that's some of the use cases that we have. And most of the time what do we do, right? Of course, for the demo sake, what I've taken is I want to build an API which is on top of SQL Server, and of course using Azure Functions and using SQL bindings, right? So SQL database, as I said, it's always there, and API people have done it enough. And some of the common things we have usually done, right? I think most of us have used entity framework. Used, right? So That's a common framework we use, and we put on entity framework, and we kind of get a good kind of coupling with Azure SQL Server, and of course you get the data out of it in a Pojo class, and you can build an API on top of it, right? This is a very common pattern that people are almost using, right? And what happens is entity framework, gives some sort of flexibility to you, right? It manages the connections and whatnot, right? So this is one way people do it. And if you are, using a different, language, right? A different language, then people also use Azure SQL SDK drivers directly. You can also have that flexibility to talk to SQL Server and get the data out of it, right? But then the caveat here is in some languages, right? Not all. There are some languages where you need to be aware of the connections that is getting created to manage the SQL connections and whatnot, right? Basically the memory and the connection pool and whatnot. So there are some caveat if you are directly going to use an SDK and use your program to connect to talk to SQL Server. And the third part, right, where I see this Azure function and SQL is coming in somewhere in middle ground between these two areas, where you can, of course, use Azure functions. And Azure functions, I mean, it's a very great tool to build your APIs. And with SQL bindings, what we can see in today's demo is, how you can quickly build a CRUD API, using just Azure functions with SQL bindings, right? And correct. So before getting into SQL bindings, right, I'm sure most of you, have used Azure functions, right? Basically, in Azure functions, the common parameters or paradigms that we talk of is one is called trigger, which is when the Azure function gets invoked, right? Basically, there is an HTTP trigger, timer trigger, batch trigger, and whatnot. So bindings basically refers to how declaratively your Azure function is able to hook on to another Azure resource. Basically, it could be a Cosmos DB, or it could be an Azure event or Kafka. Basically another Azure resource, right? So basically the connection happens between Azure function and another Azure resource. And SQL binding, specifically the topic of discussion today, talks about how Azure function is able to talk to Azure SQL through bindings. And these bindings are in preview stage. It was released last 5 months back. It is still not in GA. So this is in preview. So by the time what you see in demo, if you go back, something in it, so be aware of it. But of course, in public preview, there are 5 languages it currently supports. And though it is in preview, it doesn't mean that it can't be used for enterprise and whatnot, right? It is definitely supported for enterprise use because it supports even managed identity, and that's why, right? How can the Azure functions talk to Azure SQL using secure connections, right? Managed identity, I think most of us know, right? Because if there is a Azure service which wants to talk to another Azure service, right? So that's when we go with managed identity instead of using something like your own connection string, username and password and so on, right? So it's all supported out of the box. And another thing which we need to be aware of it is the version, right? So Azure Functions Runtime v4, which is the latest functions runtime that we have. So SQL bindings is only supported with version 4 of the runtime. And I just want digress a bit here in the sense of I think functions runtime 2.x and 3.x, if I'm not wrong, is also getting deprecated soon. So maybe we have to think of how to migrate and land up with Azure Functions 4.x runtime. And of course, it offers a lot more functionality than just SQL bindings like isolated process, .NET 7 and whatnot, right? So it's a good area to catch up what's happening with Azure Functions v4 runtime. And Azure SQL bindings, of course, it's part of, it's only supported from this version and so on. Any questions so far? Please feel free to interrupt. It's fine. Right, so I think we'll probably get into the demo quickly, but I just want to show what is an input binding, output binding, and then we'll get into the demo of how we build the API from the scratch. So input binding, output binding, the way I relate, right? Input binding, output binding is not new in Azure Function. We have had with bindings with Cosmos DB and SQL DB. Basically, you see from the context of the Azure Function. So input means data is coming into Azure Functions, right? So that's what the input binding. Read data into the function, and now the session is on SQL, so it is from database. So if you see, this is a snippet of a function which we have it in demo. Maybe you can just focus on this SQL part, right? So this is something new. Earlier, what people used to do, I also have a sample of what people used to do earlier, right? Without SQL binding, how we used to connect to SQL. But with this, you can just think of there is a direct SQL statement out there and some sort of statements, and the data is available to you. So that's what I want to focus right now on this slide. But we will see little more depth through the demo. And there's a connection string, of course, connection string is always needed, so we will also see how we can abstract connection string appearing directly from your function here. So this is about input binding. So the opposite of it is of course output binding, where a function can get a payload. You want to create data into SQL Server, like post data, create data, like update some data. So that's where you can also pass a payload to your Azure functions. In that case, it is going to either modify or create the data into SQL database. So that's the key difference between input and output. And of course, it can also take stored procedures, right? Because we are talking of SQL Server, we can't miss the stored procedure part. So you can automatically invoke a stored procedure also if you have any sort of logic. In case present in a stored procedures, you can do that as well. Right. So these are about input binding and output binding. And pretty recently, I think probably a month back, another addition also happened, which is called SQL trigger. Right. So I think do you all know like what is change data capture? Change CDC. It's called change data capture. So change data capture is basically a functionality of most of the database that we have. So basically any change is happening to the database, right? So database is basically a row and column and set of rows tables, right? Any change that is happening to a table, and we wanted trigger of what is changed. So basically it tells you what data is getting changed. I can tell you a good example, right? Maybe what we are using in our live production data, right? We use Cosmos DB, and in Cosmos DB we go and Cosmos DB is a NoSQL database. I'm just trying to tell my personal use case where we are using CDC to relate to this example. So we go and update certain data. The data is more about you can think of it as about shipping destination and whatnot, right? Say a vessel has reached the destination port, we go and update that in the database. And from the database, I want to capture the event at what point this destination got updated, and I want to trigger this to the downstream system or applications, right? So this is a practical use case that we have, and of course you could do it from your business logic and whatnot. But the more you are putting from the database, if you are trying to release the change, right? It is more integrity is managed, right? Now the data is getting updated in DB. Now the database is trying to let the change go upstream, right? So that is the the good point of using change data capture, and I will show you where we can use through the demo as well. And there are some constraints, basically some prerequisites that we need to do to use SQL trigger. For input and output binding, there are not much prerequisites, but for SQL trigger, let me show you what are the steps that we need to do. And another good point about using Azure functions, right? It is auto scaling, right? So basically functions by itself is auto scaling. And then when I talked about the other two way of connecting to SQL Server, right, where you have to manage the connections on your own with your SQL drivers, you need to be aware of the data that you are trying to pump in or trying to read from the database. Like of course, if you want to multiply the pods, or if you are running it in a VM, you should manage the load and memory and whatnot. But with Azure functions, you also get this feature of auto scaling. Of course, there is a runtime auto scale that we need to enable in the portal. But once that is done and sorted, your Azure function runtime will take care of creating or spawning multiple instances of Azure function as the data that you are trying to read or pump is getting increased. So these are the good points of talking Azure SQL and Azure functions. But maybe we can get into the demo. Just want to take a pause and check if there are any queries so far.
Right. So in a simple way, can you describe? Input binding, output binding means whenever any data pumped into systems, database system, then this function will get invoked, is it?
That's what triggered.
Oh, that's what triggered.
Yeah, three things we have discussed. One is input binding,
where
we are trying to read the data. The second point is output binding, where we will try to put a payload into the SQL Server.
Okay.
This will build a CRUD APIs like create, read, update, delete.
Right.
The third point is a trigger, SQL trigger.
Yeah. So function is all about invoking dynamically, right? Triggering. So in case of input binding, you were saying that whenever data will get, repeat this again. Okay. So I think in input binding, whenever data will get pumped into database, then that function will get invoked.
No. Okay. I think good point. So what I want to trigger is the trigger is still the same. So trigger, you can still continue to use the trigger that you want to have, like HTTP trigger, timer trigger, whatnot, right? So there is a binding that you see here, this point, right? So the trick for when you are trying to build a web API, right? So you can have a get endpoint, which is going to basically it's an HTTP trigger, right? So once you call this get endpoint, instead of placing this code in your web API or elsewhere, right? You can use Azure function with SQL binding. With this point of code, you will be able to get the data that you are interested in. It's not about triggering the function. That part comes in Azure SQL trigger, where if you see this function gets triggered automatically now when the data is pumped in. That part is in SQL trigger. I think maybe with the demo you might be a little bit okay.
Yeah, now I understand. It's like input binding, output binding in context of API.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And in trigger, whenever something happens within this SQL server, then function is going to sense and do something.
Exactly. And that will say how it is able to try to get a release out of it in the demo and show you how that is actually working.
I have another question. Yeah. So right there when you write await products, add a something. So I know it's an example, but when you write await products at async, it is not, it's committing to the context, right?
It is committing to the database in fact here. That's what is happening internally through the SQL binding.
So it directly commits to the database. Then that is not output binding.
No. So output binding is you are trying to update the data into the database, right? So from here I am taking a payload. Maybe I will walk through the demo itself, so that point instead of maybe that will become clear. So before I get into the demo, okay, it's not visible. Okay, the show. Alright, so some of the prerequisites what I have done to make this demo run. I am running SQL Server in my local and Azure SQL Edge, if you are able to see the screen, right? So that's the image that I am currently running. So Edge is running in a container in my local Mac. And if you are in a Windows machine or if you are in a Mac non-ARM platform, you can also use SQL Server itself. So in my Mac, that image is still not available, so I am using SQL Edge. Of course, it also supports all the flavors that we have seen so far. So this is a container that I am trying to run, and what I have taken for a sample use case, right? Of course, it's connecting to my local host, which is connecting to the SQL Server, and I have created a database called products, and basically couple of tables called product and category. I think it's so small, right? Is it visible now? So there are two tables, category and products. Of course, it's a simple table, with list of products and category to help us write the CRUD APIs. And there is okay, let me go to that also. And there are two instances of Visual Studio Code open. One is, if you see spotted, right? One is in green color, which is, talking about how do I even set up this, right? So setting up the database, I think it is little away from the topic, but I just want to cover this SQL projects also a bit. So there is something called SQL Server projects, which is also available right now. So if you are writing SQL Server DDL statements, right? So what you can do is you can also create a SQL Server project today, and this project you can create DDL statements, and through Azure Data Studio or through VS Code, you will be able to make DDL statements, build and publish into your destination server, right? So this is what I've used. If you see this is a workspace, but of course if I go to the SQL Server project, so if this is what I was trying to say. See, I created this create table. This is all my SQL table, and of course it also gives you good operations, say CD kind of a thing, right? So now this source code can be pushed into Git. With GitHub Actions, you will be able to do your data level schema changes and whatnot, right? So this is what I've used, and of course there is a stored procedure also, which I want to do the demo. This is all about setup part, and going into the Azure functions itself, right? So this purple color is what we're going to talk about, how I've set up the CRUD APIs on top of the Azure SQL functions. Right, so let me bring it down. It's as similar. So the first thing that we have to do is use this the third package reference that you see here, right? So this is after starting the plain vanilla Azure function, the first thing that I did was adding this NuGet package reference, which is Azure Web Jobs extensions.openAPI. So webjobs.extensions.sql. So it's in public preview, so you need to if you are using NuGet CLI, just include pre-release as well, so that package is getting added. right? This is the one I'm talking about. So this is going to give you all the SQL binding, input, output, and SQL trigger, right? So this is the extension that I've added, and I also added Open API, just to expose Azure functions to Swagger, right? I mean, because we've talked about an API, right? API looks complete with a Swagger, right? So that's what I've added Open API as well. And yeah, what I've done is, if you see, there are input binding in my left side. This is called input binding and output binding, and there is an example for trigger as well. And let me go into input binding. And the first, of course, the CRUD APIs we talked, right? It always starts with getting a product, right? Reading a product from database, right? So this is what it is. This is a simple function called get products. It is going to, it's an anonymous, and it's a root called get product. So if I pass so in my table there is an ID called GUID. Let me show the table structure. So it has got GUID followed by name, number. ID is a kind of a primary key that I'm trying to use. If ID is passed, get me that specific product. If ID is not passed, first fetch top 100 or top 10 or not, right? So this is an example, and this is SQL statement, if you see, which is directly written over there. And during my conversation I also told what people used to do earlier, right? So maybe this is commented. I am not planning to run this. So if that SQL binding is not there, what we used to do, we used to still have HTTP trigger, and here we used to create a connection, SQL connection, right? So that's how we used to write an Azure function earlier, right? And this connection management is, of course, now left to each of the functions that we write, and we have to manage the SQL connection and open the connection, close it, and adapters and whatnot, right? So this lot of statements we are supposed to write, and now this is being simplified, with this input binding, right? So we just have to, as a developer, I am just now worrying only about the data that I need. I am not concerned about the way the connections are managed, or the way that I have to write all those open and closing and flushing the connections and whatnot. So it basically takes two parameters. One is the SQL query. If you see the first one, this is the SQL query itself. Of course, you can go as per your imagination what SQL queries you usually have. And the second parameter we need to pass is command type, which is of course telling if it's a direct SQL statement, you will use text. If it's a stored procedure, you will use just a stored procedure. Parameters are optional. In this case, we are having ID. If you see that parameter itself is optional here, right? So of course, this parameters, when you have a parameter, use it. Otherwise, you don't have to use. Connection string. I have not put open connection string here. It is coming from my local settings .json. So it is pointing to my SQL Server localhost, which is running in the container that we have. And by default, when you try to get a container, of course, don't hack my server now. Password is open. But of course, I want to show this trust server certificate is equal to true. Because what I faced while doing this demo was trying the trigger with my local, right? I need to, give this flag, otherwise it was throwing this TLS error. So this is something that I, realized when I was trying to get the demo done. But that's about the connection string. So once that is done, you can reuse that connection setting in each of the functions that you have. And here I'm trying to return the products. So this is about get products. And maybe I can run now and show you how does that. So I have functions runtime. As I said, I have version 4 of the runtime. Did I delete something?
So behind the scene, what does it uses? It's another framework like ADO.NET. We are just we optimize the code. Yeah.
I think I deleted something. Yeah, begin the screen. Basically, Azure functions SQL binding. Understand there is a SQL resource which I need to connect with that connection string, and it creates that declarative connection. Like it's similar to the other bindings how it is working with Cosmos DB and all. Of course, down the layer, it will also use this connection. Whatever I showed earlier, right? It opens the connection, tries to run the query. All that managing the connections is all abstracted from the developer now.
What it called earlier, we were calling ADO.NET. Is it the same? Behind the same?
ADO.NET.
It's the same. It's the same.
It's the same, right?
I mean, I have a couple of queries. Like does this product thing is like synced automatically? For instance, like I bind, it looks like I bind at the startup level, and when I'm going through the run, what if the data changes in the products from other functions or something? Is it get continuously synced? Whatever we have.
No, it depends on when you trigger, right? So the data integrity, so Azure functions will not, take care of the data integrity aspect and whatnot, right? So the moment you trigger, right, at that point, whatever data is present in the database is you're gonna get the same. So this is a get product, right? So you can go to the get product here. Of course, I want to pass the ID. I can do that. Take this sample ID. It work? No.
Even execute.
Didn't I?
Error not found.
Let me go to it. I have another option as well. Maybe that data is not there. Alright. So if you could see that, it's the same thing. I'm not sure why it is not working from the Swagger, but it's the same thing. So I'm trying to get to my local function, get product, pass the ID. It is going to get the product that is out there. So this is a simple CRUD API, right? So this is what we have done in get product, and of course delete product is also an input binding because the data is coming, right? Because I have written the way that once the deleted, right, I want to fetch the data what is out there. So let me show that code.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So with the binding, does it do a retrial also if the server is?
Yeah. So there are options that you can configure in local settings.json. I will show that there are options that you can give for retry, timeout as well. Because we are talking of a SQL connection, right? So it is a tendency to timeout and whatnot, right? So there are options that you can control, and those you can think in local settings.json, right? So once that is done, it will automatically pick up those parameters to honor that. So delete product. So this is as good as, but here one of the thing is you want to we thought we will use a store procedure, right? So I am calling delete product and I am trying to pass the store procedure name. It's a delete product. The route is also delete product here. So once the product is deleted, I want to just capture the rest of the products in the system and show it to us, right? So that's all about delete product. And these are the open API specifications. I mean, if you need Swagger, you can use it. Otherwise, those are optional. You don't have to use it. And I think this is about delete product. And here it's again a SQL binding. Takes two parameters. In this case, it is about store procedure. So passing store procedure name followed by command type. And parameters are again optional. If you want, you can pass. Connection string it takes. These are a couple of parameters and followed by what data you need. Of course, product is my Coco class I have. And then output binding. So output binding, I think we can talk about create products, right? So output binding is basically I want to pass a payload to my function. I want to create this data. So payload comes as part of products here. Again, I want to pass a list of product. It's a collection of product basically. So you can see a list of product, right? So that is a list of products it's going to take. And so it's again going to be called by HTTP triggered. So I have got a SQL binding here. In case of output binding, we want to tell which table that I want to update, right? So of course it needs to know the table where it wants to create the data. So dvo.products is my table name and connection string and my data over there. And what you see is I'm some sort of logic I have put, right? If ID is not there and whatnot. But here it is up to us to write the business logic what we want to have, right? So you can of course write the logic that you want to put and create the data. Similarly, update product we have, so it is all about update. Again, I'm mentioning the product table where I want to do the updates, and it takes the connection string and the product which I want to update. And here I'm using another thing called created result. So far we have used object result and OK result, right? So you can also use an extension called created results, which is going to bag all of your output what just got created through the SQL, put it into an object for you. In this case, it's called output product, right? So it is going to emit that as part of the output. Maybe I can just show it. So we talked about create product, right? So I'm just going to create the same thing again. Let's see, the API is already running, so I'm going to create, and it should have probably created now. So before I could run, there are 11 rows out there. I'm not trying to run the stored procedure. Alright, so there are 13 rows that I could see now. So 2 more rows we were able to create. And so next is update, right? So we will also talk about update, and I'm not sure if this is existing, so I'm going to pick one of the ID which is existing out there, use it here, and update the rest of the parameters. So maybe before update, it's called pastel color small. Let me just run. Becomes pastel color. So update works because it's all executed through the Azure functions in the backend, which is able to bind it, to the SQL server. Of course, gateway I've already checked. Delete. Maybe I can delete the same product again. Alright. So delete. I said I'm going to take a snapshot of all existing products and bind it here. Of course, the product would have got deleted out there, so we should not see that AFI. Number of rows is 12. Right, so this is how we write a CRUD API, and if there are no questions, we can go to the trigger part. I think that's still a good time. Okay, to enable trigger, what we are supposed to do is I'm planning to go to my data studio.
I have a query. Like, does it work with this transactional flows also? Like, what I could see is, what if I try to update 3 or 4 tables, and what if I want all the 3 works or none of them works?
Transactions you need to manage, because once the data is getting committed, right, you should be aware of the transaction. Maybe you can write it into stored procedures and call that invoke so that it is intrinsically managed.
Can I use a query like how you use link use and all?
We can use it. I mean, within the Azure function, any other C# constructs if you want to use, you can absolutely use it. Yes.
Because like previously we used to define these transactions like separately. Like what I see is like directly we are giving this queries in the form of a binding, and then we're just using that object.
So see what I also have to say is so this is going to give a quick way of writing a CRUD API, right? If you have more flexibility around transactions, managing the data and integrity, right? Of course you can use the other options of interacting with SQL Server. Stored procedures is of course one of the way.
Transaction at business logic level, I think.
Sorry.
Transaction at business logic level, .NET framework transactions. I think that we can't.
You mean SQL transactions?
Yeah, we create a business logic level transaction, right? Begin transaction. I will be having.
Correct. Yeah, begin transaction and transactions that you get to do
one
with entity
transaction
framework
at
as well.
stored procedure level,
Yeah.
and one transaction at business logic level. So we can maintain.
I'm not sure, but what I'm thinking is maybe that kind of flexibility you should probably look
Right.
at.
I think in that scenario we can
Go back to the old way of using entity. But this is a quick way of, because I have an API, I want to write quickly expose CRUD operations, right, or search operations, right. So that's where the change retention, so I'm going to enable that. Okay, it's already enabled, maybe, yeah, fine. So this statement, right, so what it enables is the SQL Server is, it is letting the SQL Server know that the change has to be tracked. So it kind of creates internal sys tables where the change captured. Change retention, that is the number of days in the history how long that SQL Server needs to manage the change. And auto cleanup is, once the change retention is not being used or the number of leasing connections is going off, which I will tell you what it is, the auto cleanup jobs will automatically try to clear off the leases connection. So we have to set at the database level, and we also have to set at the table level. So there are 2 things that we have to do, and I think both I have already completed, so that's what this guy says. Okay, it's already enabled, so maybe let me go to my program, and trigger I have commented here, so I will also uncomment that. Going to restart. So this trigger, going into the code of this, right? So far what you have seen is, we are passing a payload and HTTP trigger and all that. So if you see, there is something called SQL trigger. This is what I was trying to say. Whenever changes is happening in the SQL, this guy automatically gets picked up. Basically Azure function, there will be an instance of function which will be running. And when it runs, I am also giving the table, because in product table is where we have enabled change tracking. So you need to explicitly enable change tracking, and each of the table you want to track the change. Give the connection string, and the output of that is going to come into something called SQL change. So this is a new collection bag, which is going to get a type product, and of course that is I read only list. It is only going to get the read copy of what changes is happening in the database. And of course this logic I will leave it to you, but in the current example I am just going through the list of changes, trying to emit it and put it in my console to have a check. So what we can do is, I am going to go into my REPL, I am going to update a product, and let's see what is coming up, if this SQL function is getting triggered automatically. I am not going to call this function at all, but I am just going to run my update trigger here. Maybe I will ADC, this is existing. Not sure if terminal I can maximize. So is it visible? So if you see executed product trigger, so what we did was we just updated one of the value for ID that is already existing, but I just want to focus on the last line which says executed product trigger. So that's a trigger that we have automatically got executed, and then the previous line, it's basically since I have emitted what got changed, right? So the new value what has got changed and what got updated, we are also able to get that change. And it also tells what is a change operation. So change operation could be an update, or it could be a delete and whatnot, right? So all of the changes which is happening in the database, if you're changing the data, now Azure function will be able to get a copy of it, and now it leads to the use case, right? You want to let the downstream systems know about it, or you want to notify somebody of this change. All that now is possible with the SQL trigger. So product trigger we have not executed, to a question, right? Now product trigger automatically got invoked because we are changing the data in the SQL server. And this is where this auto scaling and all that concepts would come in, right? Now maybe you are pumping in a lot of change, right? At what point you want this function to be triggered. So there are configurations for all that where you can go and specify in your local settings. And I think there are 3-4 parameters. Of course, after the time we will also show you where to go and check all this and how to set it up, which will tell you, that this Azure function should wait for say 100 milliseconds before it can trigger. For example, if your application is such that the number of data updates is happening in some standard order, you can go and specify all that, so that you will not unnecessarily trigger an Azure function side. And a key point to note for SQL trigger, it is only supported in premium and dedicated plan, not in the consumption plan. So that is something that we need to be aware of. So we should have a premium Azure functions plan, and only that it is supported at this point of time.
So, as per architecture per se, right, SQL Server, any kind of plan, any kind of deployment, either managed, standalone, in any kind of deployment, it is supported, right?
Yes.
So SQL Server I have deployed somewhere,
Yes.
right? Function I have deployed in function I have something, right? So how whatever changes happening there within the SQL Server, logs are being maintained there.
Yeah.
So how SQL Server will be invoking my function?
Yeah, that's
What kind of binding and SQL Server?
So this guy, SQL Server, the moment we enable the SQL trigger, two things happen. Once the trigger is happening for the first time, SQL Server understood, okay, now the change tracking has been enabled, so it is going to pump the changes, and because of the SQL binding, what we have done in SQL trigger, this connectivity happens. If you see, there is something called Azure function global state, Azure function leases. So this is going to contain, this function leases is going to contain the unique instance of function that it is supposed to be triggered. Because we have registered with the SQL binding, this magic automatically happens internally. Now SQL Server understands, okay, this is a function instance where it contains the instance ID, and that's where they are talking about premium, right? So maybe in the consumption plan they cannot hook onto the instances at the time. But in case of premium plan, once your Azure function is started up and running, it will be able to talk to the Azure function through this releases connection. And as a many functions you have, this data gets written over here, and that's how SQL will understand. Okay, next time I again update the same product. I am not interested in the previous update because it's already tracked. It's already pumped into my Azure function, and I already let my customers notify about all that, right? So only the current change, what is happening, I should trigger it, right? And there should be a checkpoint for SQL Server to know until what point I have pumped it to the Azure function. Basically, until what point the change has been tracked. So all that is managed between these two tables internally of the SQL Server. So this gets created. Earlier these were not there, if you have observed.
So this binding happens when I will start my Azure function.
Not
running state, right?
Whenever the first trigger happens. So the product trigger is already created, right? So when I'm trying to do the update, this guy understands. Okay, I need to pump up, the change.
But before that, this auto change has to recognize which function I have invoked. Okay? So function, suppose I have built my SQL Server, I have deployed there.
Yeah.
I enable change log on.
Yeah.
Right. But still my SQL Server don't know which function I have to trigger it. Then after 1 day or few hours, I deploy my function. So deployed means I deployed, but until function is not running, how that function will come to here and say that okay, who I am and I am going to subscribe for this kind of event.
Yeah. So that happens also through the binding that we create. The moment you run the function, there is a binding that happens. So that through that binding, the SQL Server understands. Okay, there is somebody who is trying to watch the change. That's all internal, right? So that's how the connectivity happens between the function and the SQL Server. But then the function doesn't run by itself, as you said, right? It is waiting for the SQL trigger. So the SQL trigger has to happen, and that is what is happening when we updated the product out there. I think most of the demo I had for Azure SQL is done. I've got a good 10 to 15 minutes we can talk about Power Pages. Any more questions? Yeah. I'm not going into okay, let me just walk through that as well. Any Power App developers here? Power Platform? Anybody used? Maybe I have to ask anybody who's Power BI? No?
Power BI you have to use.
Then you are a Power Platform. So if you see there are...
Power Apps I've not worked into, but Power BI I know some dashboard reports is what.
Of course, yeah. So Power BI is also a product of Microsoft Power Platform.
Yeah.
And there are a lot more products, and the recent one is called Power Pages. Power Pages is basically, there is something called Power Apps earlier, right? So we had Power Apps, and Power Pages is an addition on top of Power Apps where you can expose business to consumer products. So far Power Platform product, right? It is meant for organization for the internal use, right? For example, you want to write a flow, you want to trigger an email whenever it comes in a Teams group and whatnot, right? So these are the integration people used to build. But with Power Pages now, what we can do is we can build enterprise-ready web applications which you can, as an enterprise, you can expose to the outside customers also, right? And it is a low-code, no-code solution which I can demo it. And I think with that time, maybe I could just walk through the demo. I'm going to skip this slide why we need to use Power Pages, but of course that I will talk through when I'm trying to demo the page itself. So how to create a Power Page, right? We told it's a website, right? That's what we wanted to do. I have to end this room. So to start a Power Page, where I have to go is make.powerpages.com. Make.powerpages.microsoft.com. So this is where you will start. And of course, when you log in for the first time, there is an option to try it free, and you need to be part of an organization. And if you are an individual user, if you are not part of any organization, if you want to try it, talk to me in the break. I will tell you what to do. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip that part, but it is going to help you give a low-code, no-code solution to build a website. So this is how it looks, Power Pages, and since I've already logged in, it gives me an option to create a site. And what I'm going to do is, I've already created something called Custom Sports League. I'm going to open that and show you, walk through the different feature sets that we have. So this Power Pages, of course, it's not in preview. See, I mean, there is a bug over Power Pages actually, because if you have noticed at the top that it was reading as Power Pages preview at the top. Now it automatically changed to Power Page. It got GA. I think a couple of weeks back it was generally available, so you can all use in your enterprise if you can use, right? Maybe I can show you a simple website that I built before I could go into the details of how I built it. So this is a simple website. I thought I am part of an org called Fabrico, and we are managing an NGO, and we want to organize events outside for people in Bangalore, and this is just a common theme I have put. And this is a simple website if you see, and of course it has for a website like this you can become a volunteer, donate. You want to organize this event, you want to take requests from different people, and you want to use this website to organize, right? So this is a concept that I have put, and let me show you how I built it. So I just created a site. So to create a site, if I click it, right, by default Power Pages offers us some sort of templates. Because Microsoft knows what kind of people are trying to build, right? It gives some sort of templates. It gives templates for government organization, it gives for school and education, and if you are free to use any of these templates, it gives you some sort of common starting styling and themes to start with. And I have used one of it, and I think I have used one of the site design template over here and created my site over there. And once you create a site, this is how it looks, and it contains the left side, right, there are 4 tabs you could see. One is called Pages, Styling, Data part, and Setup part. So Pages basically talks about the common web application or web page that we have as part of this application, right? So there is a home page out there, and if I want to create a new page, I can go and create add a new sub page. I want to call a page name as table tennis. I think table tennis is already there. We had somebody from volleyball, so I'm going to do volleyball now. And maybe I want to use a standard layout or custom layout. If you have any custom layout created, you can do that. But I'm going to add the page to the my navigation. Just click add. So now if you see, the volleyball got added automatically here, and moment I click preview, it is basically a live site, guys. So basically I can host the site, open with a DNS, and it's out there, right? People can access it, right? If you have your internet connection, you can access. Of course it's not DNS, it is currently running in my local, but I could do so once the site is ready. So you see, volleyball has come there, and now this page what you are seeing is for volleyball, right? What do you want to do? Like, you want to describe about the event, or you want to let the data, or you want to let people register for it. You can do all that, right? So of course these are the custom things that we can use: text, button, an image, video, right? Basically you can embed whatever custom things that you want to embed here. And also it gives you a view to enable put the Power BI, right, as an iframe. So you can also do that if you have the reports. So this is about page, and if I want to move volleyball within table tennis or maybe cricket, right, for some reason, I can also do that. Alright, so now volleyball and cricket has become a sub-page. So it's kind of a low-code solution, right? So you don't have to write any sort of code and whatnot, right? So that's how the web pages it's all about. Now site is not about just creation of web pages and these components, right? So there is something called styling, and styling basically offers some sort of default styling. If you want to change, you can do that. So maybe if this color is not so good, I want to use this, right? So automatically, you could see what style thing that we are trying to choose gets changed there. And in an organization, maybe if you want to do branding, right? So for example, being part of an org, you will have your own branding. So automatically, if you have your own CSS custom themes, you could also export it here. And if time permits, I will show you how to do that custom theming as well. So what I am trying to say is, it is giving you a good option of controlling the style sheets, and it's also giving you a good way of managing the application web pages. And the third part is, of course, the important is the data part. So now we have created a web page which is good. For example, if I want to register a team, right? So let me go and show that the preview. I've already done the registration for one team. Maybe we can do that. So this is a custom form that I built. And while you create a form, it also tells you what you are supposed to do. So I I don't think I have good enough time to show it, but it also gives you a good view of what is that I have to do after the form has been submitted. You can redirect to a different page, or the data gets into a table, which is what I want to show you right now. So where is the data? Like, of course we also need to get the team registered and whatnot, right? So if I go to data part, and there is something called registration details, and this is a table that I created, and it is going to get the data out there. So this is the one that I created earlier, and now what we have created has come here. But of course, if you want to create a new table, you could do so. Create table, and you can create contact as contact registration or whatnot, and there is an you can once the new table is created, you can also tell what columns that you want to be there in the table. Once this part is completed, there is a way to expose this table in the UI, and maybe let's try it out if we have time. So in the Power Apps platform, there is something called Dataverse. So Dataverse, you can imagine like it's kind of a data universe. I mean, that's called Dataverse, right? So that's how our Power Platform manages all the data that we have, right? So this data gets into the Dataverse, and for people who wants to know, okay, now the data is available in this Dataverse tables, how do I want to get it into, say, Azure Function or Azure SQL? There are connectivity from Dataverse to Azure SQL. So those are all, maybe outside the discussion of this forum, but it's still possible. The data that is lying out there, you can get it to, Power Pages or Azure Functions and outside the boundary as well. So the new table is created. I will just go with name. I think that's fine now. But I want to create a new form. So table basically represents the physical structure how the data is stored, and form represents how I want to display this table in the UI. So I will create a new form and just call it as test, create. And the other advantage of using Power Pages is the security, right? So you can also think of, I don't want anybody to log into the site and register. You want to control with single sign-on and whatnot, right? So those things are also possible. And I think I will just save it. I will component, save it, and then publish the form. So once the form and data table is all published, you can go back to your site and use this form in your website. So let the form get published. In the meantime, I also want to go back, to a couple of options and say pages. Let me go there and let me open volleyball, and here I'm going to add a form, a new form. Here the form table. It's called contact registration, which we just created. And it is about test. That's what we created. We can go to data. Data is not there, and what I want to show, right? I want to create a new record, or I want to update. All these are also out of the box, right? It's all through the drop down that we are able to create now. And then on submit, what I want to show, like this is what I said, right? You want to display a message or redirect to a page, or you want to redirect to a different URL, you could do all that. CAPTCHA, I don't want CAPTCHA. And attachments, if you want to enable people upload any sort of files for post processing, right? So you could do so. I don't want to do all that. I'm going to create it. Let's see if that works, but I think you all get the idea, right? So this is how it is done. And once the table is added, you also have to set the permissions. By default, it opens, the permission which you are allowed, which you can allow the people to come in. So maybe let me put test, and I want to give permission to read, write, create, and whatnot, and it's a global access. So there are other access which you can do. Like if you're an Azure AD, you can also control if only people of your are supposed to access. You can do it through just the drop downs here. Right, and I'm going to give global access, and you can also add roles. Roles all again coming from Azure AD. So whatever roles you define here comes here, and if you are part of the same environment, you will be able to see all the role here. Right. So click save. So now people anonymous access I have enabled. So people who comes into this page will have access to it, and let's see that in action. And it also gives you a desktop and mobile view, right? So if you notice, right, there is a mobile barcode out there. So if you want to scan that, it's automatically responsive. You don't have to do any customizations on that part. I think I added in volleyball. Of course, I think the permission is not set for some reason. I have to figure it out why. anyways, in the meantime, right, let it come, but you got the idea, right? You can set the permission and you will be able to view the table and submit the form as well. And what I want to show is, of course, once the data is out there, you can also have Microsoft Flow that is out there. So once the data is out there, you can write a flow. If you are an org, right, if you are writing a low code, no code website, if you want to capture the data and you want to post it in Teams, you can write a Power Automate flow and integrate with the Dataverse table, and the data will be available out there. And I also told how do I publish this data to outside world, right? So you can get into portal management. You will say advanced configurations, where you will be able to link with Azure other sign-on providers like Google and whatnot, right? Let me show that. You could do traffic analysis, and you can also just not able to go to the point where. And so this is for low code, no code, right? And also for the point where if you are interested in writing the code, you can also go and open the website in the Visual Studio Code. So there is something called edit code. It also, if you are a developer, if you want to have more control on what the content you want to create, it also opens the code what we have created there. So it's about low code, no code. No code is what we have seen. Low code is about how do you get some of the access, right? So if you want to do customizations, and I think people, if you have to write a JavaScript and whatnot, right, it's also possible to do it here and control it through the site management. So this is all about Power Pages, and I think we are also up on time. Probably take some more questions and we can.
Probably one or two questions maybe. So how the data ingestion goes to the tables which you are showing in the templates are local to the Power Pages. Like I just want to say, like those tables won't be created in the Azure SQL. Suppose we want to ingest data from the Azure SQL to the Power Pages. So the tables which you created is locally to the Power Pages itself?
Yes, it is local to the Dataverse. Dataverse is it's how the Power Platform manages the data, and Dataverse you can create for each environment. So whenever you start your Power Platform thing, right? So there's something called environment you can create. Whenever you create for the Power Pages, first time it will ask you an option to create an environment. So now the data is unique to it, but you can expose the data. You can go to Dataverse. If there is a time outside this context we will talk, and from the Dataverse you will be able to expose the data to a different Power BI or Azure SQL, whatnot, right? So.
But this again requires, the second question was again this requires a licensing as well, right? Similarly to Power BI, it requires the license to publish the code, like these things which you said.
Correct, it requires of course licensing.
Afterwards as well.
These are part of Office 365 products.
No, I think for licensing part, I'm not so clear, because Power Pages licensing it's a different one, right? So because it depends on the number of sites you want to publish and all. If you have seen, right, even the site that I tried to publish, the one that I created, long time back, it is only valid for 2 months and it automatically gets cleared. But Power Pages you have to acquire a new license. I think licensing, even I'm not so clear with Power Pages, but it is not part of Office 365, that is for sure.
So as part of Office 365, maybe Power Automate you get to some extent.
Yes.
There's a personal license which Power Automate is going to be the flow, what we used to be called, right? So you can automate some of those tasks, but to do anything else with the Power Pages, it's separate licensing.
No, but there also in Power Automate which I have used, there also I think some kind of
Yes.
limitations.
There are two things. One is a personal license that's assigned to your Office 365 account, what you have. Other is an enterprise one that you need to get if you want to do more things with the Power Automate.
Yeah, so I can tell you how I tried it. Maybe offline we can connect. I just created another Active Directory, another user for myself to use it. But yeah, I can show you how do you do that.
Any other questions?
Posting, what about posting?
Posting, there's an option to, so if you go to the landing page, right? Again, there is a workflow for that, so you can create your custom DNS and you can do that. So you can go to Admin Center. So there is an admin center where you will control some of the key aspects, right? For example, if you want to correct site analytics or if you want to host your site, and manage the permissions and whatnot, right? So there is an admin portal for your Power Pages. What we saw is the editing part from the developer side, but there is also admin side to our application, right? So that's where you will get into admin center. And people who have used Power Apps, right? This admin center is something similar. So it gives the same control what we have for Power Automate and the rest of the Power flows.
It's a SaaS basically, right? So everything is hosted there. You can only do a domain mapping and then you can map your domain to whatever. Let's say you want something like Swaminathan if you want to have it. I can just map it to this Power Pages app and this gets hosted there. So you don't get a full control of where it is hosted or anything because it's a SaaS product. The idea is more of low code, no code. So everything else is taken care of by Microsoft.
So this is where you have the data was basically the admin part of it, right? How the data is, I don't know, doesn't work now. Maybe I can connect an automate.
Previously you have shown on settings, right? Where something published state, something else.
Was there?
Yeah.
Trying to look back. Yeah, correct. It was there. Also give you a go live checklist. And I think this progressive web application is also a recent addition. It was not there last time, like 3-4 months back it was not there. Now this also they made it as a progressive. So you can see the convert site from trial to production, right? So these are the checklists you can probably run it. It's also out of the box. I have not tried it personally, but if you want to try, we can do it. And this is the convert site to production, right? So this is what is going to do that. And I think that needs licensing, which I don't have. Right. Anything else? Questions? Otherwise, we are done.